Slowhands Rock Talk Show.
Ian, thank you so much for making a little bit of time out of your morning to come on, speak to myself about all things music. A fellow Scott, a fellow Ian as well, so we're all good here. But before we get started, how are you actually doing?
Today's episode is sponsored by Drumport. Drumport are known as a distributor for high-quality musical instruments, including their innovative Stomp Tech product line. A must-have for all musicians looking to expand their sound whilst keeping full control of it. I have mine here. Make sure you check out Drumport at www.drumport.de and get your own today. Now back to the video.
How am I doing? Well, I think I'm doing okay. I thought, well, now that you ask me, I can probably find something wrong to complain about, but no, I'm okay. And I better be okay because I have to get a flight tomorrow to fly to Athens for a concert and then Cyprus. And so I have to be in good shape and in fine fettle to do my job. Especially in 33 degrees centigrade of temperature.
Yes, slightly better that than certainly for central Scotland where I am. It's starting to turn into winter.
I would much prefer it to be like it is with you and indeed down here in the southwest of England because performing in those temperatures is not only uncomfortable but more than a little dangerous at my age to be doing two hours of aerobics in that kind of a heat. So I have to be careful.
That's fine. We'll go back, obviously, just talk about your career and get your thoughts on various musical aspects of it. But I know, obviously, you were born in Dunfermline. You moved to Edinburgh before eventually settling down in Blackpool. And I kind of looked up a couple of your interviews. I know that your early musical influences came from your dad's big band jazz records. Did your dad actually play an instrument or did he just enjoy listening to music?
I have a feeling he might have had a little go at the banjo, since I do remember seeing a family photograph of my father with a banjo, but it was not something that I was aware of as a child. He didn't have any musical instruments at home and didn't show any musical inclination other than these records from wartime big band stuff, American music. But my mother, and I didn't know that either as a child, my mother actually, my brother told me many, many years later, long after my mother had died, he mentioned, I see you're playing in Manchester in a particular theatre, and he said that's where Mother performed when she was young. And I said, she performed? What do you mean she performed? And he said, she was in a modern ballet group. She performed at this Manchester theatre as a dancer.
All right.
As a modern classical dancer. And I was astonished to hear that. And then he gave it the double tap by saying, and she played the violin, which I had absolutely no idea about. I mean, she never admitted to any artistic background of any sort in my lifetime of knowing her. And certainly, maybe I can only assume that when she got married, she had to leave all that behind her and head up north to live in Dunfermline. And maybe she made that conscious decision to cut off everything in her previous life and to become a wife and mother. And so gave up the artistic pretensions that she might have had as a teenager and as a young person. But, she met my father, I think, when she was probably about 22 years old.
Yep.
In Blackpool, which is why they decided, God forgive them, for moving back to Blackpool when I was 12 years old and already kitted out in my uniform for Edinburgh Royal High School. And suddenly over the summer holiday period, just before I was due to start the first term, they suddenly announced, "Oh, we're going to go and live in Blackpool," and that was, I mean, a real blow, because not that I was particularly enamored about going to school anywhere, but it was being torn away from Edinburgh, which I was coming to grow to like.
Yep.
During that year or two before we left, because I was able to get on a bus and go places, which was really quite exciting. I had no idea how far the number 26 bus went from Murrayfield to the far boundaries of suburban Edinburgh. It was really quite exciting. You could just sit on the bus and take it all in, and then get to the final destination and take a little walk around, get back on the bus and come home again. It was all very exciting.
Yeah, you can now do the same thing, obviously, with the tram that's running in Edinburgh.
Yes, and the tram, when I was a boy, the trams were delightfully old-fashioned, and they didn't go to Edinburgh Airport, but they certainly ran the major routes and through Princes Street. And in fact, the tram was part of my very early youth. It was, buses had taken over by the time I was a 11-year-old schoolboy.
But you yourself, you're an instrumentalist. Obviously, I think your main instruments are vocals, acoustic guitar, harmonica, flute. I know you do other instruments as well. But of all the instruments that you play, which one came first? Which one did you first learn?
Well, it was the guitar, because I think it was on my 11th birthday, my father bought for me a beaten-up old Spanish guitar, which wasn't really an appropriate instrument for the kind of music that had just become notable in the subculture of UK music, as a result partly of the influence of American presence during and post-war, because there were a lot of American servicemen stationed in the UK, and indeed in Edinburgh. We had a couple of friends at school who were American children, and along with them came an awareness of the earliest forms of rock and roll. And then skiffle, which was our homegrown attempt in the UK to emulate that bluegrass music of the Appalachians in the USA, which in turn was informed by the music that had come to America from the immigrants, from the Dutch, from the Scots, from the Irish, who brought with them elements of their folk music, and all of that was turned into something else, which became bluegrass. And that, in turn, became skiffle in the UK, most notably presented by Lonnie Donegan, who had a few hits with an oddly quirky accent that he misappropriated from American soil, and with his Glasgow twang turned it into something quite unique. And Lonnie Donegan was the starting point, not only for me, but I have read for many of my peers who began playing music around the same time. We all heard Lonnie Donegan. We all got the Bert Weedon book Play in a Day in order to learn a few chords on the guitar.
Yeah.
And then we all listened to Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Chuck Berry and got bitten by American rhythm and blues. And then we went on to do our own thing. Whether in the case of Eric Clapton, he stayed with the blues largely, and in the case of other musicians, we ventured into more exotic climes and further influences from different sources. But yes, it was all part of the growing up. So guitar was the first thing, and I didn't pick up the flute until I was 20 years old, and decided to give up playing electric guitar and to take up another instrument instead. And for no good reason, I just traded in my white Fender Stratocaster for a flute and a and an American Shure Unidyne 3 microphone made in Chicago. So I began playing the flute really in December of 1967. I finally coaxed a note of G out of the instrument.
And I know at high school you had formed the band with friends, the Blades. Was that your first band that you ever played in?
Yeah, that was at grammar school in Blackpool, and we had, just a couple of guys in my class who seemed to be interested in music, plus one that had been in my class earlier in my secondary school, second and third forms. And he was a musician. He did music, and he was his mother was a piano teacher, so he got a drum kit. And Jeffrey Hammond, my classmate, didn't play any instrument at all. So we said, "Okay, you better play the bass then, because that looks the easiest."
Yep.
And the three of us started off banging away in John Evans's front room in Blackpool. And his mother was very, very, very tolerant of the din, and from afar encouraging, although I think she would have preferred that he'd been a pianist. And indeed, we got a drummer, and John Evans switched to playing the Hammond organ and piano, which gave us then a rather bigger range of sound, and that was the band that was the precursor of the Jethro Tull band, which started in January of '68.
I'm always quite curious as well, because when you think back to the 60s compared to today, it's a very, very different time, and there's a lot of different views now, things that were accepted back then that are different now. But I would imagine a parent back then, if their child had said to them, "I would like to be a musician, I would like that to be my career," I would imagine the reaction back then could probably be quite similar today, which it would, I don't want to say frowned upon, but it's a very difficult career to make happen back then, and even nowadays as well. What was your parents' thoughts of their son's ambition to be a musician?
Well, they did what parents would be expected to do, which was to gently discourage me from pursuing music other than as a hobby, because they wanted me to go on and go to university and be a doctor or a lawyer, or to take up a profession, and all of which I could understand as a 16, 17-year-old. I understood their point of view, but quietly I had aspirations really from the age of about 17 or 18 to actually, maybe give music a serious go in terms of a career opportunity. I did go through the motions of finding another job, which was at the age of 16 or 17, I took myself off to the local police headquarters in Blackpool and attempted to sign up as a police cadet with a view to having a career in the police force.
Right.
But they dissuaded me from doing that, said go back to school and get your A-levels and go to university and study law and then come back and we'll give you a really good job in the police force. So they gave me the same kind of parental advice, I suppose, that I was already by then used to. I then went to the Blackpool Evening Gazette to try and become a cub journalist. I said, I'll make the tea, I'll run errands, anything just to get started. And they tossed me out on my ear for not dissimilar reasons, which was they were looking for people who were qualified. And I think they rightly detected that I was running away from something and trying to enter into a job that was a bit more romantic. And so they gave me sensible advice, but that left me only with my third career choice, which was to become an international rock star. So I decided I'd have to go for that one instead.
And you did not too bad with that.
No, it was fortuitous because when I started, I guess the odds were, maybe 1 in 1,000 that a young wannabe musician could actually achieve any success. But today, I would put that as closer to being 1 in 1,000,000.
Yeah, yeah.
Because these days, and for the last, I don't know, since the advent of the internet anyway, in the late 1990s, then we could assume that it's pretty much up there at the top of the list of things that people want to do, is to become a musician. When I use the term guardedly, they want to become a pop star, or they want to become a DJ, or they want to do exotic things. They want to be. Yeah, can you imagine someone having a career choice? Oh, when I grow up, I want to become an influencer. Oh no, dear, oh dear.
The world has went a bit crazy, I think, in the last 25 years, probably with the introduction of the internet. It seems to have went crazy, and it's funny. There's a lot of people, like, you see all these television programs, the X Factor and Britain's Got Talent and all that, and there's people go on those shows to become famous, but there's still thousands of great musicians out there that are playing the clubs, they're busking on the street. There's so many unbelievably talented people out there, and they're not doing it to be famous. They're doing it because they love music and they love creating something. But there's a whole element of people that are in it to simply be famous, which I don't understand.
Well, I sort of understand it. I don't really approve of it. I think that you should play music because you love it. And I often have said to younger musicians, there is no disgrace in not pursuing your dream and not succeeding as a successful professional musician. Carry on being an amateur musician, because the very word amateur comes from the Latin amo, I love. Yeah. And that is really the best state of mind to be in if you're a musician. I also have said to those same young students, think of it this way: for typically 3 or 4 days a week, I am an amateur musician. On average, for 3 or 4 days a week, I'm not earning money out of playing music. I am playing music because it's something I do for fun, and I get a lot of pleasure out of playing music for fun, and I hope I never lose that. Yeah. I mean, today I have to play some music that isn't necessarily for fun, but it's not my music. Something I said I would play on somebody else's record, so I have to learn that piece of music and try and immerse myself in what that artist is all about, and see if I can do a respectable job in aiding and abetting their latest effort. Yeah,
but Jethro Tull, I think it forms around 1967, but the first album it's released in 1968. What I love about those old bands, there was no messing about. It was the band forums, and you go into the studio and you record this album. See, when you think back to those very early days starting out, does it feel like yesterday? Does it feel like a long time ago now?
In my civilian garb, yes, it does. But when I walk out onto a stage, in that kind of a context, it seems like last week, because I walk onto a stage and I open the show with a piece of music that was recorded in July of 1968 for our first album. Yep. In fact, the first 3 songs we play in the current set list are from the first album. And so through those songs, I am immediately transported to that state of mind and the physical reality of performing those songs as they were performed back in those first few months of Jethro Tull having got together as Jethro Tull. Yeah. So no, in many ways, it doesn't seem the passage of time is eradicated by the musical link with the past.
Yeah.
And in other ways in life, nothing to do with music, I am also linked to the past because I have a great fondness for history, the history of art and culture and religion, which is my broader context of who I am and what I think about various aspects of life. I'm a keen, I wouldn't describe myself as a history student, but I am selectively a keen history student in as much as I pick and choose. If you ask me to list the English kings and queens, I wouldn't know where to begin. Sometimes even forget that we have one at the moment. But generally speaking, apart from the dates and the memorizing what often seemed to me to be trivia for history at school, as we were taught it, I have a much greater sense of enjoyment out of learning about the culture of times gone by, whether it's relatively modern history from perhaps the Second World War onwards, or whether it is going back to prehistory, which often interests me and fascinates me, along with, tomorrow night I will arrive in Athens, and there it is the seat of ancient learning, of a lot of good stuff and a lot of bad stuff.
Yeah.
I'm always mindful of that when I go to visit Rome to perform concerts, that, a lot of good stuff, a lot of bad stuff, and a lot of stuff that is vaguely in between or misinterpreted or misunderstood, and sometimes, as in the context of Roman Catholicism, sometimes, historically speaking, misdirected. Religion has a lot of things to be to apologize for. I noticed and noticed from your accent as soon as you started speaking, I was transported back to last night when I was watching episode 3 of a TV series called Cold Water, in which my son-in-law is the star.
Yeah.
And he is an English person who's moved to a small town, notionally somewhere in the Highlands. In fact, it was just north of Glasgow. He was staying in Glasgow in a hotel all the time he was filming that. And but it's a sort of a notional kind of small town somewhere in the southern part of the Highlands, possibly somewhere not too far from Loch Lomond or wherever. And he's thrust into the middle of a dark and twisted plot, which seems increasingly to involve dark doings from the local vicar and her mysterious, very weird and scary husband. And so, I might even watch another episode of that before I get on the plane tomorrow, because it's really rather good. People either love it or they hate it. There's no in between. It's a bit like The Walking Dead, in which he spent 10 years of his life filming. People either love it or they hate it. And I think it's rather better to be doing those kind of movies, those kind of TV series, than to be remembered as, oh yeah, I saw him in such and such a thing, and it was okay, yeah. Being okay is not very good. You want people either to be just really besotted with what you've done, and if it's not their cup of tea, then it's better off that they really dislike it.
It's funny that you mentioned that. Just about an hour ago, my girlfriend left for work. Just before she left, she'd said to me, Andrew Lincoln's got this new show. She must have seen an advert for it. She's like, looks really good. We need to watch it. So there you go.
Yeah, it's on ITV. You can probably get the first 2 episodes on Catch Up, and it's on ITVX, where if you subscribe for free, if you don't mind the advertisements, And being a Scotsman, I'm far too mean to pay extra money to avoid the advertisements. And my wife, who's from Yorkshire, is equally mean, and she doesn't pay for the advertisements either. So we do occasionally watch things that are of interest to us. And but yeah, it's a good one. He's actually in a play as well at the moment in the West End of London, and I think tonight is press night, which is torture for him because all the press will be there to watch the play, and afterwards he has to do what he hates even more than I do, which is doing a meet and greet afterwards, because when you've just done, in his case, a 2.5-hour show, it's pretty exhausting. And you just want to go back to your dressing room and quietly disappear into the night. You don't really want to have to do meet and greets. So it's, one of those things that I suppose you are obliged to do for the sake of promotion and publicity, or just to be friendly sometimes.
Talking about historical places and events, you played the Isle of Wight Festival, 1970.
Yeah, that's right.
What's your memories of that gig on the day?
Well, my memory primarily is of chaos, because I never personally enjoyed playing festivals. The first one we ever played was actually the original, the very first Hyde Park festival that took place in the summer of 1968, and it was Pink Floyd, who had just lost Syd Barrett at that point, and Pink Floyd and Tyrannosaurus Rex, Mark Bolan, and Jethro Tull, and my old pal Roy Harper. And so it was those were the 4 acts on the very first Hyde Park Festival. And then a month or so later, we played actually not a month or so, a year or so later, we played, 2 years later, I think, actually, we played the Isle of Wight Festival, which was the end of that era of tolerant hippie love and peace. Yep. Things were getting pretty dark and scary. People were angered by having to pay for a ticket. They smashed down the barriers. There was a lot of violence. A lot of the acts, including Jethro Tull, were not paid. We knew that we weren't going to get paid. I mean, it was pretty obvious from the word go that the whole place was in financial ruin, as well as, half the 600,000 people who were at the festival didn't pay. So, the cost of putting it on was enormous. And so, some artists like Tiny Tim refused to go on stage until he had the money in cash in his hand, and held the promoters to ransom, trying to scrape the money together to persuade him to go on stage and play. We knew we weren't going to get paid, but we went on anyway and just tried to make the best of it. But we were on the closing night. It was Jethro Tull, I think the Moody Blues, Jethro Tull, and Jimi Hendrix. And Jimmy didn't want to close the show, wisely and understandably, but equally wisely and understandably, I didn't want to close the show either. So we had a race, our roadies raced to see who could set up the gear first, and whoever managed to get the gear plugged in and make a noise, boom, would start. And we won. So we went on and left Jimmy to have to close the show, and it wasn't one of his best shows. I stayed for 2 or 3 songs, and I thought, he's not having a good night. And then a couple of weeks later, Jimi Hendrix was dead.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of unbelievably classic bands now, when you look back, that appeared at the festival. Jimi Hendrix, obviously, you've mentioned. Was there any other ones that you wanted to see or got a chance to see?
Well, generally speaking, at festivals, I don't hang around. As soon as I can, I just get out of there, because I don't like crowds. I'm actually really uncomfortable in crowds of people, and being on a stage is okay, but being backstage with crowds of people in a place where I want quietness and solitude, then I'm not definitely not in my comfort zone at festivals backstage. So I haven't really seen people that I particularly wanted to see in that context, but I have performed over the years in alongside many great artists, sometimes on television shows. And so I've been able to get on stage and play Smoke on the Water with John Lord. I played Sunshine of Your Love with Jack Bruce. I played, and in fact, I played on another occasion with Ginger Baker. And I've played House of the Rising Sun with Eric Clapton and a string, not with Eric Clapton, with Eric Burden and a string quartet. So, I mean, those are three highlights. I played Nights in White Satin with Justin Hayward. I've played a couple of things with Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden. I've many times played with Mark Armand, the 80s synth pop guy, who's become a big friend. So I've had the opportunity to play with a lot of people that I admired and enjoyed working with. Phil Manzanera from Roxy Music, and Hugh Cornwell from the Stranglers. So I've covered a lot of bases from, early blues through to the punk era, in terms of having been able to briefly acquaint myself, musically speaking, with a few other artists, and that's something that's quite memorable. Yeah. I performed on record with most recently with a famous pop star from an era before I began. I played on an album that is going to be released later this year, I believe, with Engelbert Humperdinck. Can you believe?
All right.
Yeah, okay. Play flute on a and sing on a track with Engelbert. Such a weird request. I thought, well, if I don't do it, I will regret that later in life, that I turned down the opportunity to play with Engelbert. So I thought, I have to do this, which was kind of fun. And same, I was asked to play on a Christmas spoken word album with William Shatner, the guy from Star Trek. And again, it's one of those things that is just kind of such a weird thing. I thought, I have to do this. So, yes, I've done a few oddball things like that too.
Well, here's a question for you, because you've obviously been playing for such a long time. I'm always kind of curious to get your thoughts on this, since you have been doing it for such a while. Jethro Tull starts in the 60s, and the recording equipment that you're using back then, it's so unbelievably primitive compared to what we use nowadays, but you're still recording nowadays.
Well, I think you have to take it down to the basics. I mean, in many cases, records being made today, people are still using exactly the same microphones as were in the studios back in the 60s. Yep. The Neumann 87, a classic valve amp from early days, is still a sought after microphone for vocalists today. Along with the ribbon microphones that were used in the times of the Beatles, and the early BBC recordings of classical music, they are still sought after today, and still manufactured in some cases. So a lot of the technology is exactly the same.
Here are bands though back in the 60s. A lot of the recordings were live. It was the band playing in the studio.
Yeah,
they didn't have the luxury of having a limitless amount of tracks and overdubs and things like that to do. It made the band almost more creative.
Well, there's nothing stopping anybody doing that in this day and age, even if they're using contemporary digital recording technology, because the principle of it is exactly the same as the principles back in the 60s. We still take a number of separate sound sources that are either from a microphone or sometimes what we used to call DI, direct injection. In other words, you took the signal straight from the back of an instrument or an amplifier and straight into the recording mixer, and you mix those sounds together, and they go on to, in the very original days, a couple of 2-track recordings, as was the case with the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper. But a year later, which is when we began. A year later, it had moved on to 8-track recording, which was a big step forward. And then a couple of years later, it was 16-track recording, but it was still using analog tape. And I recorded using analog tape right up until, I think the last one probably was somewhere in the early 1990s.
Yep.
Although I did use digital technology from the late 80s onwards, but I still work with an analog multi-track machine into the early 1990s, and only became fully digital in the last 20 years. But the principles are very much the same, and the recording technology, the software that we use, looks like very much the way things used to be, except that you have relatively unlimited tracks you can record on. But you can go in the studio with your guys, you can work together, you can rehearse, you can all perform live in the studio together, or at least, in my case, to do the backing tracks together, and then you can repair, you can fix any errors or change a part, add some solos, add the vocals, or in my case, the flute. So things that it's better to do separately because of the audio leak. If you're a vocalist, you don't want to be in the studio next to a loud drummer because the drums will be all over the vocal track. And so you want better audio isolation. So it's usually better to do that as an overdub. But quite often in the studio, I would be singing the song and playing the flute parts as a guide to the other guys who got used to hearing it in rehearsal. So when we're recording, even though I'm not recording my part, there's no point, I would still play in order to give them a reference point for certain parts of the music where otherwise they would be relying on what they've written down in front of them rather than having the audio cue from hearing other people's musical parts together. So I've always taken the view that it's better to try and write and record in a way that allows you the least possible extra work when it comes to performing that music live on stage. And indeed it does. When we can all learn our parts from the record, or relearn our parts from the record, walk onto the stage and play it straight off, because we recorded it and arranged it that way. There are no dark holes or places where we can't recreate what we did on record. We can usually do it or close to it. I mean, there have been some records, for example, where I played electric guitar on the record and played the flute. And sometimes I played the flute and sung some parts at the same time. That was a bad decision to have taken, because when it comes to performing it live, you've got to pick and choose what you're going to do. Yeah. So I usually try to be forward thinking when it comes to arranging and rehearsing the music prior to recording.
Yeah. But do you have a preferred way when it comes to songwriting? And has your songwriting process changed throughout the years, or is it still the same today as it was back then?
It's a solitary pursuit. It always has been. I can't sit in a room with anybody else, either to write any music or to have the presence of anybody around me when I'm in the creative moment of beginning that work. I think I've usually, many of the songs that I've written have been, the sense of being alone has been because I'm sitting in a hotel room somewhere in a far off land with an acoustic guitar, which is how I wrote many of the early albums. These days I would tend to go in a quiet place in the house and sit with a guitar and the flute, maybe with a mandolin or some other instruments, and fool around for an hour. And usually within an hour I have one or two ideas that I've just quickly made a note of on my phone, and then I can go back and listen to them again the next day and fine tune them a bit and develop them to the point where I can take those musical ideas before they, just maybe a few lines of music, and then I will start to see what I can do in terms of adding lyrics to that idea before it gets too advanced musically. Sometimes I sit and write the lyrics first, and then I take those lyrics on a piece of paper and go into a quiet space and fool around with the guitar until those lyrics inspire me to a sense of melody and rhythm and cadence. Because the way you write lyrics is rather like the human voice. If you're even speaking it, it's ups and downs. You don't, most of us try not to speak in a flat monotone where everything is blah, 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 and the same. We tend to, our voices rise and fall with emphasis, and the pace at which we talk changes as we go through a sentence. And so it becomes, if you read lyrics out loud, it starts to have a musical context straight away. Maybe it's like that for poets who write words with no musical context at all, except maybe in the case of Robert Burns, who did write songs as well as unsung poetry. So perhaps he did have more of a feeling for music than your average poet. Yeah. But I think poetry has never really played a big part of my life because I do need the music as well. And when I write words with no music, quite quickly I have to find some music to bring them to life.
Yeah. But see, looking back at all the albums you've done, I had to be looking at this, 24 Jethro Tull studio albums, 6 solo albums, there's a couple of live albums thrown in there, 30 plus albums. That's a lot of music over your musical career. I'm going to ask a question that I don't know if you'll have an answer to it, but is there one album from all of those to choose from that's your personal favourite?
Just a very quick message to say thank you for watching. Remember to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so that you don't miss any future videos, like and leave a comment, let me know what you think of the episode and give me some suggestions on who I should interview in the future. Back to the video.
As you can imagine, that is a question very commonly asked of all the people in the world of arts and entertainment. What's your favourite book you've written? What's your favourite movie you've made, or whatever? And most of us will in a slightly embarrassed fashion, slip around the edges of that question and try to avoid telling you who is our favourite child or grandchild, because that's how it seems. And I feel that I can narrow it down probably to half a dozen albums that I say perhaps are my personal favourites because I feel a sense of achievement, but to get it down to a single one really would be quite impossible. And so I can give you a few. The album, our second album, Stand Up, because that was one where as a singer and songwriter I got away from the world of Black American folk music, i.e. the blues, to bring in influences that were far more eclectic and included jazz and classical music and some elements of folk music. And so that felt like a major step forward, in which I was somewhat inspired by the 1967 albums by Pink Floyd, the Piper at the Gates of Dawn album, and the Beatles, who were a prog pop band at that point with Sgt. Pepper, progressive pop. And, both of those were illuminating in the sense they gave me a little bit of inspiration in trying to go beyond the music that had been presented on a plate because of the culture of the times, which in my case was blues and rock and roll. So I got away from that in '69 with Stand Up. And then a couple of years later, the Aqualung album, which was more of a singer-songwriter album in as much as it had lots of songs that were essentially songs that I could go out in the studio and perform on my own, and then the others could sometimes add something to it, or a string quartet would miraculously appear from the wings. That would be another one. Thick as a Brick, because it was a landmark entry into, albeit a slightly Mickey-taking progressive rock album, a bit of a satire really on the idiom as it developed. Songs from the Wood, because it brought together elements of folk music. And then a couple of albums that I've made that were rather more in the realms of drawing from classical music. A couple of solo albums, the Divinities album, which was an album for flute and orchestra. Those are satisfying moments on a personal level, but it doesn't mean that all those other albums are somehow second-rate or rejected. It's just that I have specific reasons for liking those.
Yeah. See if you could go back now and speak to yourself who was starting Jethro Tull, that young man, assuming that you would listen to yourself, what advice would you give to yourself?
Relax and try and have a good time. Because if I have a fault, and I'm sure I have many as a human being, but if I have a fault that stands out, it is impatience, the tendency to be self-absorbed, the tendency to be a little downbeat and insular in my personality, to feel the effects of stress and anxiety. So I think I would say relax and have a good time. But you know what? I would ignore it. Because those very same faults, as they might appear, particularly on a social level when it comes to others around me, those very faults are those that I think drive me on. I have impatience, I have enthusiasm, I get besotted with certain things, and it's that creative drive which I think comes out of frustration, of feeling that you didn't quite nail it last night, last month, last year, or last decade. I am reminded of the name of Frank Zappa's band, the Mothers of Invention.
Yeah.
And indeed, the mother of invention tends to be, in my case, frustration, anger, combined with a huge curiosity for things that are perhaps not the stuff of most musical lyrics. So, a lot of my lyrics do go to places that the average pop and rock music does not. Maybe that's a fault, maybe it's a good thing, but I have little interest in writing endless love songs, whether it's about being in love or very often being out of love. But that seems to be the stuff of 95% of pop and rock music lyrics. Yeah. And I am utterly bored with lyrics when they just talk about that state of mind. It seems it's all me, me, me. Taylor Swift, even what's his name, the pop guy, Ed Sheeran. Whenever I hear lyrics talking about how they feel about things, it's emotional outpouring. People seem to feel the need for having a kind of oral graffiti presented to the world, as if we're interested in what they're going through. I understand that most people love that because they identify with it. They think, oh, Ed's singing for me. I feel that way too. Or Taylor Swift is singing about something that I feel, and she's singing for me. And people identify with it in that way. But I am utterly bored with lyrics that just talk about. Alanis Morissette probably takes the biscuit for singing songs that are so heart on sleeve, and she's a great singer, great artist, great songwriter. But yep, listening to her songs, I just become quickly a little angered by the self-absorption and the need to tell us who she is and what she's about. When life surely can't be that simple. At least I hope it's not. So, I'd much rather hear Alanis Morissette pondering on something a little bit more objective. I like Bruce Springsteen as a writer because he is an objective writer. He writes about stuff. He writes about people and places and the culture of life that he knows from growing up. And he writes with authority. But he is able to put himself into the picture and give it a sense of it really being, of it having that authority, because he is the guy singing from his own memory, from his own passion, from his own particular insider's viewpoint. And so, I think he's a very good songwriter. I like his approach, which seems to be combining objectivity with a personal standpoint. But he's not really telling us so much about how he feels about something. He's telling us how that something is. And so it is absorbing, almost like it is a black and white documentary movie. And you can fill in the color and you can fill in some of the details from your own imagination. I am a black and white photographer most of the time. I shoot with a Leica M11 monochrome. It can only shoot black and white in 60 megapixels of glorious definition, but it only shoots black and white. And I like that because in some ways it's very limiting, but it allows you to present images where you're concentrating on the form, you're concentrating on the composition, you're concentrating on the dramatic contrast of black and white and the many shades of grey that fill in the detail. And so I find that much more rewarding than shooting with a colour camera, which ever more, year by year, becomes closer to the snapshot on your iPhone, or whatever phone you use.
Last year I went to Rome on holiday, and I sat down in the plane, and there was a guy sat next to me that I started talking to, and he was a photographer. He was just going to Rome by himself. He'd got himself a new camera, but it only shot in black and white, and he was going to Rome to take some photographs, just to spend a long weekend getting up, walking around the city, exploring, taking photographs, and we kept in touch. He's obviously on Instagram, but he's got his photographs there. And there's something special about it just being black and white. It does add something to it that it's almost like it can be too perfect if it's in colour. There was something really nice about seeing...
Yeah, I think what it adds to it, it adds you to it. Because you, as the observer, get to imagine the colours if you want to. If you're in Rome, and I was in Rome taking photographs just last February, but if you're there is, as in most city centres, there's a bewildering. Your eyes are assaulted with so many colours and so many advertisements, so many shop windows, so many people wearing coloured T-shirts and whatever else. It is a mess. Visually speaking, it is a mess. I shoot colour only when, usually it's a landscape. Sometimes I feel that could benefit from shooting colour because it's natural. It is the world in a very natural and blended way. So landscape photography, sometimes colour has a place in that. But generally speaking, if I'm out and about in a city or in a place where there are other people and things going on, then black and white photography for me is far more satisfying. And, you can, to some degree, transpose that idea to the world of writing lyrics and making music, that, I think you have to try and create the basic shape, the basic form, and the basic words that will fire somebody's imagination, so they, as listeners to your music, can fill in some of the detail and put their own personal stamp on the end result. Making music with no one to listen to is a bit of a pointless task. You make it because one way or another you're hoping that you are going to listen to it. Your fellow musicians will listen to it and enjoy it. But, you're hoping that other people will derive something from that too. And I think there's something that they derive. The end product of what they derive from listening to your music is a combination of what you as the musician have done and what they, as the listener, interpret to arrive at that final result, which is hopefully the reward that comes from making music. And so music means different things to different people. There is no absolute certain way in which, as a songwriter or a performer, you can know how people are actually going to feel or interpret that music as being. I think for everybody, whether you're listening to the Beatles and Sgt. Pepper or whether you're listening to something I've done, either way, I can't be sure how people are going to hear it. What will they make of it? What are the elements that will fire their imagination or give them some feeling of reward? Because I know for sure when I listen to things, I will sometimes hear music I've heard many, many times in the past, and suddenly I'm hearing it and getting a whole new viewpoint on that music. I'm hearing detail I didn't hear before. I'm hearing something from the lyrics that I hadn't really picked up on before. So even listening to the same music on different occasions over many, many years, you can still find something new, a new way of hearing it, a new point of view having listened to it. So if you imagine, you can extrapolate that idea across the millions of people who do hear music and come to the conclusion that, there is many different ways of hearing that music as there are people who have listened to it, which obviously is in the case of successful music artists. We are talking in the multi-millions. Yeah. And that's somehow rewarding.
It's the beauty of music. And the fact that everybody can take something different away from the same piece of music as well. But Ian, before we finish up, I like to ask some fun questions just before we finish. I'll ask the question, you tell me what pops into your mind.
Sounds like they're going to be fun for you, but not necessarily for me, but fire away. Go ahead.
If you could go back in time, anywhere in the world, what's the one concert that you wish that you could have attended?
Just to be sure that it was a big mistake had I agreed to perform at it, it would be to pop in for about 20 minutes into Woodstock. Because that was in 1969 and Led Zeppelin and Jethro Tull were asked to perform at Woodstock and we both said no for possibly different... Actually, it could have been the same reasons. I think we both were playing at the same gig. We were supporting Led Zeppelin in Chicago, I think, that night. So, and we flew to Chicago instead of doing the Woodstock thing. So I guess I would like to assure myself that it was the right decision not to have played there, because I remember asking my manager at the time, who said, this is going to be a huge festival, and it's just we didn't use the term pop-up festival back then, but it effectively had been organized at very short notice. And he said, all the great stars are going to be here. The Who are going, and Jimi Hendrix, and blah, 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 blah. And we should really be there because it's it could be a huge showcase for the band. And I said, well, I have two questions. Are there going to be a lot of naked people, and will they be taking drugs? And he said, yeah, both of those things, yeah, for sure. And I said, I think I'll be washing my hair in Chicago that night. Yeah. So I didn't like the whole hippie thing, and so I just would have felt totally out of place being there. And it was too early for us. We had only just almost got off the boat or off the aeroplane on our second American tour, and it was too early to put our stamp on the music scene by having that degree of exposure. We needed a couple of years to learn our craft and develop a bit before we got too much attention. So I think it was the right decision. But I guess I'd like to be sure if I could step back and just say, yep, I'm not enjoying this. Let's get the hell out of here.
A question that's kind of similar to that. See if you could go back in time as a spectator and attend one of your own gigs. Is there a particular gig that stands out that you think would be interesting to see yourself on stage?
I'd be quite interested to see the time in 1972 when we played the album Thick as a Brick at the Albert Hall, because that was involved quite a little bit of stage amateur theatricals. Right. There was a certain whiff in the air of the recording of the album, and indeed the performances. There's a certain whiff of Monty Python in the air, and so it was a little surreal in terms of humour and its effect on the audience, who were scratching their heads thinking, what is going on here? And I would have quite liked to have been sitting in the audience for a few minutes just to witness the reaction of people around me. Yeah. And in fact, just a few years later, I did sit in the movie theatre in New York watching Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which members of Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd and others had put up the money to make the movie. Because they couldn't raise the money through the normal channels. Everybody thought it was a turkey. So the money was raised by people in the music industry who were fans of Monty Python. And so I had that experience of sitting in a movie theatre watching Monty Python and I'd already seen the preview in London when it was in its final stages of editing. So I knew what was going on, but I went with the guys in the band to watch the finished movie. And I was much more interested in the reaction of the audience around me than I was necessarily in the movie, because the Americans were rather like the audience at the Albert Hall, or indeed playing in Tokyo with Thick as a Brick. It was jaws dropped and people were going, what? And then halfway through the movie, they started to laugh. But the bits that they laughed at were all the bits that we didn't laugh at because they were too Benny Hill. The bits that we thought were funny, the American audience were going, what? They just didn't get it. And I really liked that the huge cultural gap in appreciation at that time of humor and comedy. But America did catch up in the next few years and went on to produce some of the greatest comedic movies and funny stuff of all time. Yeah. I mean, who else could have done Springtime for Hitler? I think that would have even been a step too far for Monty Python.
Something that's overlooked, I think, nowadays, but I still think it's quite important, is album artwork. Do you have a favourite album cover by another artist?
Wow. That's a very good question, in the sense that I'm not really a record collector, so I'm kind of casting my mind back on records that I remember that I didn't necessarily own the record, but I remember seeing the record sleeve back at the time when. I think one of the albums that captivated me was when I was in the first year sixth form at Blackpool Grammar School, and one of the boys brought in an album that he'd just bought. It was the very first Bob Dylan album, the freewheeling Bob Dylan, and he stands in this record. He's seen, kind of a troubadour, scruffy guy. It was the antithesis of the record albums that I otherwise knew from glossy pop stars or rock and roll people, where they wanted to look at their best. I mean, you wouldn't have seen Cliff dressed like Bob Dylan, sort of scruffy looking guy walking down the street like he had no money and he was trying to hitch a lift from. I mean, so there was something about that was a strange attraction that I felt for the rough and ready nature of Bob Dylan. Not having been then or now really a Bob Dylan fan, but I do remember that was another of those moments when I was captivated by the romanticism of the wandering troubadour in contemporary times, which Bob Dylan most certainly was, as indeed was Roy Harper, my erstwhile friend from a few years later, in our early days in the Marquee Club and just beyond. And in fact, I'm seeing seeing Roy Harper at the Royal Festival Hall. I think he's playing at. No, he's not. He's playing at the London Palladium on his probably final 4 shows ever, because he's serious. He's older than I am and not not been terribly well for much of his adult life. So Roy is doing a few shows in the UK, and I shall be there for sound check because I have to get back home because I'm flying away somewhere the next morning to foreign parts. But I shall go and see him at sound check and give him my best wishes, and be great to see him again. I haven't seen him for a few years.
Does the perfect album start to finish exist? And if so, what's the album?
I think all albums have, pluses and minuses. I mean, it's rare to find an album where every track is a great track. It doesn't mean that you have throwaway tracks that are not up to it. But at the time, most artists will feel all of the tracks are great songs and they deserve to be there. But with the passing of time, maybe you come to recognize that something maybe wasn't representative of your best work. And so there might be one or two tracks on most albums that don't quite hang in there. But one album that comes to mind, which I was just listening to recently, like a couple of days ago when I was flying back from Belgium, is an album by a white post-bebop pianist by the name of Mose Allison, who was hugely instrumental, and it was instrumental to a degree, being up until he started to sing and made an album where he sang songs that he had written. It was very influential with a lot of British artists who started in the 60s. Bands like The Who, for example, were hugely indebted to it with a couple of tracks to Mose Allison. And most of us were. He was a white guy, but people thought that he must be a black guy because of the way he played. It was kind of laconic, bluesy jazz. And at the age of 17, I was captivated by Mose Allison, and we clubbed together to buy an album called Swinging Machine by Mose Allison. And I would say that every track on that album is a winner in different ways. It contains some of the great classic Mose Allison songs, but it also has a couple of instrumentals, which are, really great pieces of music. So there's that's one where I would say it was a perfect album in as much as it fulfilled the promise that Mose Allison had for many young musicians in the UK. I don't think people knew him terribly well in America. I mean, he just played in little clubs, maybe to 50 people, but in Europe, he was much more successful, and very successful with those British musicians that grew from the blues boom of the mid-60s into the bands that they became in the late 60s or early 70s. So Mose Allison, very important guy to pass on the spirit of something that we all derived a lot of pleasure and influence from. I once stood next to him to urinate in the gents' toilets of Ronnie Scott's club in London, where I'd gone to see Mose Allison play. And just before his set, I thought I'd better go to the loo because I don't want to be sitting there and miss anything. And I sat at a table nursing a half pint of beer, which is all I could afford. And so I thought I'd better go to the loo. And I went there, and joining me, walked in and had a pee was Mose Allison. And in one of those moments when you think, "Oh, Mo, it's great to meet you," but you don't.
Oh, no.
I had somebody do that once to me. Again, standing next to somebody who walked into a toilet in a TV studio and said, "Oh, Ian, great to meet you," and offered a hand, having just moved it from what he was holding. And I was absolutely petrified.
Yeah.
It was Reg Presley from the Trogs. A lovely guy. A lovely man, Reg Presley. But I didn't want to shake his hand, given he'd just been using it to shake something else.
Yeah, and we don't need to say any more about that. As you know, thousands of great songs have been written and recorded across the years by different bands, different artists. Is there one song that you would like to have sat in the recording studio to witness the band record the song?
Yeah, Smoke on the Water would have been a great one because having known John Lord and particularly Ritchie Blackmore and to a degree Ian Gillan over many years, that particular moment, which was a song written in the wake of the burning down of the Montreux Casino, where Frank Zappa was performing, and some person fired off a flare gun, which went into the roof space and started a fire, and literally people were evacuated in a burning building, which was completely destroyed in the fire. And Claude Nobbs, the promoter, who had already by that point had already booked Jethro Tull, so he says, in 1968, 69, whenever it was, he ran back into the building to help, get people out of the building rather than have them burned to death. And where they were rehearsing across, just along the lakeside in an annex belonging to, I think, the Montreux Palace Hotel. The rumor was, and the story goes, that one of the band looked out across the water and saw the flames and the fire and the smoke coming from a few hundred meters away, and looked out, and Richie had come up with this riff, bum 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 ba ba, and they didn't have any lyrics or anything. He just had the riff, and somebody looked out and said, "Look, the smoke on the water." And somebody else said, "Yeah, and fire in the sky." And somebody else said, "Write that down." Of course, that is the anecdote, which is probably romanticized considerably, but I rather would have liked to have been there at that moment and to have been the guy who said, "Hey, write that down." It would have been a great moment. So, and for one of the greatest, most addictive pop rock songs ever. It would have been a great moment to have been there and to have just sort of been part of witnessing the evolution of it from its simplest form to.
I think it's probably got to be one of the main guitar riffs that every single guitarist learns as well.
Yeah, it is, and having played that riff in that song with John Lord on a big TV show in Germany, I thought it was a bit scary to take on that role of playing the guitar riff on the flute, but I gave it a bit of the guttural quality that I thought was appropriate for that song, and it seemed to add something, at least in my mind, and indeed the mind of the director of the TV program, was the one who asked me to play on it. I said, "But there is no flute on Smoke on the Water." He said, "No, but play it, it'll be great." And so I asked John Lord if it was okay if I did that, and he said, "Yeah." Same. I played with Gary Brooker doing A Whiter Shade of Pale, and they wanted me to play on that. And I said, "But, there isn't a flute on Whiter Shade of Pale." And they said, no, but play something. I said, "Well, I'll cover the organ part because, it's so the notable sort of line, which was kind of like something taken from the spirit of J.S. Bach as a piece of introductory music to A Whiter Shade of Pale. So I'll cover that line." And I was playing it at rehearsal, and I suddenly turned around and did a double take because no one had told me that Matthew Fisher was a member of Procol Harum, and he'd been invited to play as well on this thing and come out of retirement to play on Whiter Shade of Pale. And he was looking daggers at me because I was playing his line.
Yeah.
And I said to the director, I said, "Listen, this is a bad idea because I'm stealing his line. It's his bit, it's his camera shot and his bit of music." And they said, no, you've got to play it. We want you on this thing. So I think I made an enemy for what remained of his life by stealing his line.
Very last question for you, Ian. The answer could probably change each day, but for today, who is your Mount Rushmore when it comes to bands or musicians? Who's the 4 bands for yourself that's your favourite?
Well, it's not necessarily, I think, favourite. I mean, I like them all for different reasons, but I think in terms of landmark characters, if we're talking about a Mount Rushmore kind of physical presence, a statuesque presence of what those artists represent over the years. I mean, I could take the 4 members of Led Zeppelin, but that would be cheating. So I'll pick. And I was never a fan of Elvis Presley. I mean, the first couple of records he released, rock and roll records, I mean, I was quite fond of. But what Elvis became within a year or two, I mean, I never liked Elvis after that at all. But I think Elvis deserves to be there. Very unmistakable physical presence. And a true instigator of what was in those early days was rebellious rock and roll. So yeah, I'd have Elvis. I would probably have John Lennon, and I, might choose Robert Plant for his again statuesque flowing locks and his vocal pyrotechnics. And whom I'm missing one more, aren't I?
I give up. I can't phone it thinking beyond me nowadays. Anyway,
John Lydon from the Sex Pistols,
Right.
Johnny Rotten, because he represents another moment of revolution and someone who was really in your face musically and lyrically, challenging music. So, for different reasons, I think those 4 guys would. I'm not sure if they'd enjoy being in each other's company necessarily, but Elvis and Johnny Rotten on the same mountainside might be a stretch too far. But who knows? You'd have to ask him.
It would be interesting. But Ian, thank you so much for coming on, answering my questions, giving me your thoughts on all things music. I love the fact that you're still going strong today as you were back then. And I look forward to everything else that's coming out. For anybody that is watching, they can obviously follow you on social media. There's a website. They can get tour dates. They can get albums, merchandise, all that good stuff that comes with being a musician. But
most of it comes with going to jethrotull.com rather than those awful social media platforms that we all feel obliged to belong to because that's what people do these days. Yeah. But the most informative place to go would be jethrotull.com, where you will notice that we are indeed playing at the Usher Hall in Edinburgh next May, is it? Or is it in April? I think it's in April. And in Glasgow at the Royal Concert Hall, and in Perth, in the Perth Concert Hall too. So we have 3 Scottish dates coming up, as well as a whole bunch of stuff in Scotland's southern peninsula.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Ian, enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing your career still blossom.
Thank you very much indeed. Good to be with you.
Thank you.